I'd like to maybe encourage, there's some of you in the audience, and you know who you are, who have studied technologies and technological change in the distant past. I mean, there is a tendency to equate not only technological change with growth, but technological change with the present or modernity. But we have been using technologies for a long time, and one question that I think is going to hover above our workshop in the next few weeks is, to what extent understanding technological change in the distant past, does that bear any insight or relationship to understanding technological change today? And I think it might be useful and fun for some of you who have studied technological change in non-modern societies to maybe share some of your thoughts or experiences as to, is there really a sharp discontinuity about what technological change meant in the very distant past and what it means today? But I'm not directing the conversation. I'm just suggesting there might be a, well, actually, why not? Let me direct it. So, since I can, after your question, maybe Marcus and Sander will volunteer some remarks. So pass it on to Sander.
Yes, sir. Stepping back a second to back to Jeffrey's question earlier and about entropy, and that one of the things that makes us American and a great innovation factory is that we are born out of revolution, and so psychologically we are allowed to rebel against the past, and so we can make a better widget. It makes us terrible children, but it makes us great inventors. How does the risk of social failure, measurable in our society, allow us to be a faster innovating society as opposed to in Asia where you're a one and done? If you do one failure, your family disowns you. You never have financing, all those things. Whereas in Silicon Valley, you fail 3 times, but you do it all the right way, you get funded faster. And so that becomes an environment that allows failure not to be true failure, but in fact a stepping stone and not true loss. So, anyway, that was a comment and question for everybody to think about.
Why don't you have her answer first?
Yeah, I need the mic.
Oh, okay. Is there only one?
I think there's only one, yes.
No, there are two. There's a speaker's mic too.
Thanks. I'm Penelope. I don't know if you're the sole engineer in the room. I'm the sole psychologist. But if there's others of my tribe out there, I'd love to know. It was fascinating as I exited and came back in what you were saying, because I was churning along, I think, somewhat similar lines, from wondering about something very different, about the tacit of the tacit, or something very implicit in the mind, and that ultimately relates more to philosophy and psychology. And I even thought I might dare to raise the word religion in the room and wonder about what I really don't know, which is, are there any studies that correlate how the world's philosophies, not just economies, correlate with what we're trying to understand? Because what we're trying to understand is that what we would have thought would be true as it gets presented, it's not this and it's not that and the other thing. So each time we get surprised and learn that it's not what we thought, it's a great moment because it tells us there's something more we need to understand. So I thought what you were saying participates in the realm of what I was writing to myself about, that which cannot be thought, that which must not be imagined, cannot be done. And so what are the assumptions in our minds that are so embedded it's hard to even reach to them, about how growth and change relate to something that's already in there but may be culturally bound as well as in individuals. So what you said about if you don't think of failure in the usual way, then you're a lot freer to go other places. And I think about the constraints that religion imposes on having monopoly on the truth. So what has to be true and what mustn't be true is really limiting. So I loved what you said, and it participated more in the realms that I'm curious about.
Colin, you want to say something to that before we give it a
This is absolutely a key point on innovation. There's a great role in teams that are trying to innovate in having an outsider come in who is not deeply familiar with the technical area that's under consideration. That person is likely to ask the stupid question, right? And the stupid question is often where the innovation comes from.
So the idea of how innovation occurs is often being able to see something related in a different field that you could make use of in your field. And an outsider coming into the group is one way of doing that, but familiarity with the outside literature is also a way of doing that. And when Eric was talking about innovation and used the example of the bicycle, it wasn't just people fiddling in this huge design space, but it was the availability of certain technological improvements like the sturdiness of the parts that allowed the design to make a jump once that technology was available. But they had to understand, A, that it was available, and B, that it could be used in that design space. And so this interrelationship between different technologies and the ability of, let me call them bridge people, who can see something in one field that can be used in another, is, I think, essential. And so the clusters that were talked about in the second talk about the array or matrix of technologies that a country has access to promotes more of that innovation because there are more people who are readily accessible that have access to those different technologies that are going to be combined.
First, I have to apologize. I came only into this discussion and I have missed both talks because I flew in from Phoenix a few hours ago. But nevertheless, I think this discussion rings lots of bells, and I would argue that there is no real fundamental discontinuity between a number of the things that we're studying in the past and what you're studying here. At least the discussion as you've just had it, to me, seems totally familiar, even though we use a different language. And in particular, I don't know all the economic theories that you guys are bandying about. But let me give you a couple of examples. I think one is that one needs to distinguish between those innovations that are really fundamentally sort of quantum jumps and those that are not. We have a difficulty in archaeology to gather the first ones. So I'm basically going to be talking about the second ones. And what I can observe there in, let's say, about 700 BC is a particular case study that I've done where one finds that a group of people makes sort of a quantum innovation, in this case the making of ceramics, and that over the 3 centuries that follow, the shapes that are being made change, because every time that somebody uses one of those initial shapes, and there's only 1 or 2, people realize that they're not very practical for certain functions. And so you get a co-evolution between functions and innovations at that level. But at another level, I think there's also a very interesting parallel to be made. And that is that that is one of our advantages. We can actually study things over several hundred years or more. What you actually think that you find, and that resonates, I think, with the whole idea of tacit knowledge, is the idea that I had formulated it in a different way as value space, in the sense that as you see the technology evolve, you see that the number of points where that technology reaches into the ecology actually grows, and that therefore what you call, I think, the tacit knowledge is getting better exploited. But at the same time, of course, that generates new tacit knowledge. And I think that is another really interesting issue that we're going to have to discuss in the next few weeks. How is that relationship between the moment that tacit knowledge becomes latent knowledge, your blueprints, or even real sort of tangible technological implementation, how does that actually change the tacit knowledge? I'll leave it at that for the moment, but there are many other points, and I'm really, really pleased to be here.
Right. Yeah, I'd just like to mirror some of Sanders' points. First of all, yes, it's really important that, in the archaeological record, and especially the further back you go in time, the greatest insight into technological change we have are these, the big leaps, and we don't see those microeconomic details, or it's very, very hard to see them. But this is an important point, too, because, innovation and change occurs on many scales, and on many time scales and spatial scales, too. It just seems to be that in the archaeological record, the further you go back in time, the more sort of deductive tinkering, I think Eric's phrase was, there seems to have been, and there were fewer quantum leaps. But when those quantum leaps happened, they really were quantum. And what seems to have happened over time is basically the frequency of those change, or the importance of those small changes over time, seem to have built up cumulatively to become a more and more rapid process. Which leads to the larger point, I think, which Sanders started off with, which is if you're going to come up with a fundamental theory of economic change, then it has to address prehistory, because the story of the human species is we've always been very good at putting our brains together to push back ecological boundaries and come up with solutions to problems. We've been doing that for tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands, and probably millions since Homo erectus. So unless there's been some fundamental change in how humans go about structuring themselves to be productive, there has to be an all-encompassing theory. Or the other hand is if you want to develop a theory focused on essentially what's modern economics, that should inform what would happen in prehistory in order to set the conditions for that to occur. Or if it does require a fundamental change in our present economic structure, then it should be able to predict what that change is and why it didn't occur beforehand. So I think the sort of deep history perspective is very important in any discussion of economic growth theory.
So it seems to me that in our discussions of technology and innovation, we have to account for the fact that in almost precisely the same way that finding a better and more effective way of converting photons to electrons is technology and innovation, so too are payday loans and Velveeta cheese and securitizing imaginary assets. And we have to acknowledge that we live in an economic system which measures the growth that those things create all in the same way. And yet, some of those technologies solve human problems, and some of those technologies create more problems for humans than they solve. And so a robust theory of growth and wealth, I think, robust, forget robust. I don't live in the world of robust, I live in the world of useful. A useful theory of growth and technological innovation needs to take into account the differences between those two things. And I don't know how you do that.
mathematically beautiful.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be good enough?
Yeah, useful is a hard bar to to reach. I just want to build briefly on the comments that Sander and Marcus made, because I think both in prehistory and in modern history, we see this process that evolutionary theorists called niche construction and niche filling. And Sander's example of, you invent ceramics, and then all of a sudden you create the possibility for, not just pots, but, teacups and plates and saucers and other niches, which then create possibilities of other things. Or in modern times, somebody, the iPhone gets invented, and then that constructs a niche for app developers. And then there's a whole radiation niche filling process that goes on from that. So I think one of the things, again, I'd like to sort of just put a marker down for the next 3 weeks is getting some of the smart folks from an evolutionary background here at SFI who understand this process of niche construction and niche filling to see how that process applies in the exploration of design or product or technology spaces. And I think that's one theme that would connect right from prehistory right up to modern history.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up this discussion on the discontinuities with the supply chain question, which I thought was a very good question, and just sort of put out there as part of the potential research agenda in the coming weeks, the role of standards in enabling interoperability in complex systems. So, for example, the obvious ones are, the internet is essentially just a set of standards that allow for communication, GSM standards and CDMA standards and mobile phones. But what that does is allow networks to function at scale very efficiently with control of noise and so forth. And I actually got some very severe pushback to an assertion I made at an NBR meeting last week. So I may get the same pushback today. But I offered it really as a conjecture that we really have seen a discontinuity in really even the last 20 or 30 years in just a qualitative change in the nature of production and its distribution on a global scale enabled by standards and interoperability. That when we think about the assembly of an iPhone, it's not just like the wool coat that Adam Smith described in Wealth of Nations. That it is a different thing. And I think it gets to, to some elements of what Ricardo was talking about and the sort of complexity of the global economy enabled by standards. So I just want to put it out there. As a potential discontinuity, but if somebody wants to tell me that, things were happening like that in Mesopotamia, then just happy to learn.
Well, on discontinuities, I think that the major discontinuity that was pointed out by Erika and by Ricardo, associated with the Industrial Revolution, is the fact, one of the major discontinuities, is associated with the fact that for the first time, technology is incorporated in the systematically incorporated in the production process. Inventions, there are many inventions that we used in the West that were already there in China, but nobody knew how to do what to do with them. Why that incorporation in the West and not in China? I think it's a complicated political economy question, and the role of artisans in society, the relationship between the relative relation between the bureaucracy and free artisans and bourgeoisie in Western state. And I think it's more a matter of a historian of sociology and political institution than a poor economist like us. But the discontinuity is there in the systematic incorporation of knowledge into production. And if you want, there is another discontinuity later on, that is the use of science. And that comes more or less a century later. There was already an intuition by Adam Smith when he talks about, a lot of innovation are done by practical men, but some are done by what he called philosophers. philosophers that know everything and do nothing. That is the explicit, the verbatim citation. But it comes essentially with the 19th century. And the distance between science and technological application gets shorter as time goes by. So now we are using often relatively new science and not only old science. Is there another discontinuity nowadays? I don't know. I think that the evidence that Ricardo is pointing out on the fact that, in fact, despite globalization, integration, etc., you seem to have evidence of not a shrinking gap, but if anything, a widening technological gap with a much higher stickiness of notwithstanding internet, etc., much higher stickiness of knowledge in physical places. Let me add a last remark that the bridge, to a great extent, between tacitness of knowledge and local geographical stickiness are organizations. Most of a good deal of the knowledge in modern economies is embodied in organizations. And even organizations, as already Ricardo was mentioning, find difficulties in replicating knowledge within themselves. There is a beautiful paper by Zulansky and Winter, Harvard Business Review, I think 2000, showing how a firm that they don't name, but it's called Intel, that find difficulties in replicating inside efficient fab from one place to another within the United States, which is a very, very strong evidence in support of tacitness. So is there discontinuity in the age of Internet? Not sure.
I wanted to go back to the question of whether we should be looking for an explanation of innovation that spans all time or just concentrates on the recent past. And I would argue that it's too hard a problem to try to find a solution that spans all time, because I think the processes are different. One of the remarks that I remember that factors into a lot of this is that 90% of the scientists who ever lived are still alive today. So being a scientist is a relatively recent occurrence, and the effect that they're having on production and innovation, as Giovanni was talking about, I think is profound. And so you would expect that the processes of the internalization of their involvement in the innovation and production cycles could be markedly different than it was even 100 years ago. And that therefore we ought to at least start with a focus on how that's playing out today. And the expectation is certainly that the rate of innovation is going to continue to increase. And so those processes will become even more accelerated. And we should be focusing on that.
Join, do you want to say something about the that truly spans time and built on a few elegant first principles and can be predicted? To the recent past. That means that you find yourself restricted to details. And it's important to pay attention to details. You want to get the dates right. But details can be very enslaving, because if you want to be very careful about details, you will actually not build theories. At some point, you have to be very daring and say, these details matter, these details don't, and I think that facilitates theorizing. So to the extent that we want to be ambitious, say, no, I want a theory that explains technological change with the first hunter-gatherers and what this new tribe intel is doing, that actually can be liberating. Of course, you might fail miserably, but at least it will be a nice failure. But you might want to. Sure. Did I see your hand raised, or was I? Did I see your hand raised?
No, you didn't, but that's okay. So I guess, I think Jose makes a good point, that if you want to make a theory about something, you actually have to leave a lot of stuff out. You have to really oversimplify the world, make a caricature, and try and get the essential elements. I think in this field, one of the reasons I'm so excited about working in this field is it's a field that's rich with anecdote, but a field that exists almost entirely on anecdote right now. There is very little quantitative theory behind what we're talking about today. Ricardo, I think, is the first to admit most of the stuff he's doing, they're very simple descriptive models about data that have very powerful implications. And I think one of the striking things about some of the anecdotes is a lot of the anecdotes you would think from a narrative point of view or a subjective point of view seem very compelling, don't work out to be as compelling as you would like. And regarding continuity with the past, I think a good theory should have continuity with the past. I prefer to work closer to the present because we have better data in the present. And even in the present, one of the most striking things about this field is how little data we actually have. We have an extraordinarily poor record of what we ourselves do, at least organized in any systematic way. We actually submitted a proposal at one point to build web crawlers to go out and start assembling a database on technological change. It was unfortunately denied, but nothing like that exists. And we're losing information about what we ourselves do all the time because we aren't collecting data about ourselves. I would maintain we have a better database on, paleontology, on fossils that existed 100 million years ago than we do about technologies that exist now. And so I think there's a big task to assemble this data and try and get a much more systematic story. That story is going to leave a whole lot of stuff out and be very unsatisfying because we're just getting started. I think, as I'll maybe try and stress in my talk today too, I think we're dealing with Plato's cave. Plato's describes a guy who's chained, and all he can see are the shadows on the wall. And that's the status of what we're doing in looking at things like the patent database, which we know are not an accurate record of all technologies. They just give us some shadows on the wall that we can start to build some systematic knowledge from.
Actually, thanks, Jose. I wanted to comment, I think it was your discussion about discontinuities, and just suggest a couple that we might look at in the next week or so. And I think one very striking discontinuity is the fact that we attribute value now to information. And it was actually just recently recognized in the way that the United States measures GDP. Intellectual property is now an acknowledged part of that in other countries. Yeah, right. And that seems likely to be a trend that will increase as we get better and better at mining whatever we think mining is out of information. The other one is related to the networks that you talked about, which is 12, 13 years ago, we came up with something called web services. And one of the visions that we had of web services at the time was that it was going to allow essentially plug and play of industrial networks in a dematerialized kind of world. So that, on a 15-minute notice, I could switch my shipping from UPS to FedEx, or from a supplier in Thailand to a supplier in Korea. That never quite got realized because the IT complexity was still too high, but I think it is an aspiration that people have again in cloud computing, that those interfaces will allow us much more flexibility in how we compose and recompose these networks that I think are very important. So those are two suggestions.
reason that the web services didn't work out the way you were talking about was a failure of standards. Okay, that what web services promised was essentially an operationalization of those standards. But without the standards, there's no interoperability between the services that individuals supply. And those we didn't invent a mechanism to get those standards in place. And so each company had its own interface, and therefore you didn't have the marketplace for that. And so it really is an issue about understanding the operational interfaces between the capabilities of different companies that are providing those services, so that you can establish a service-based economy.
So now this will be truly the last comment, and then we break.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to make a little comment about the idea of making general theories, but also then to go on some specific question. If we try to emulate what happened in science, science didn't develop with the idea of making a general theory. I mean, that was theology that always made general theory of everything. Science worked the other way around, namely making one small, sharp question. So, in my opinion, this is the way, because we are at the very beginning in this direction. This is my perspective. So, let me propose one of these sharp questions. We have seen from Riccardo beautiful work in the past years and today on the importance of diversification for countries. So this challenged very big ideas of the past. I'm a physicist, by the way, but now since a while I look into economy also. And so this was a big it was a big surprise. So surprise is a nice element in science. Now one can make sense, of what are the consequences of this surprise. One can also do the opposite. For example, what Riccardo and I also work a little bit in this area, what we try to do is to say, well, we have the triangular matrix, what are the consequences? And of course, this is empirical, it's phenomenological. We don't know why there is a triangular matrix. So I think the basic question is, what are the mathematical properties of the structure of countries and products which lead, what are the minimal mathematical properties which lead to the triangular matrix? I think this is the question I'm now trying to work. It's simple, it's very limited, but at least it's a sharp point. The other thing is, for example, one can argue, well, maybe the triangular matrix is due to globalization, because after all, specialization has such a strong feeling that it is right, specialization, even though I disagree, as you do, that is the real element of the countries. But certainly in specialization there is an absolutely strong ideas that it is right, that there are many right things. And in fact, when you look at companies, specialization comes back. For example, we extracted from Bloomberg, a student took quite a time, he extracted from Bloomberg the following property. There are 38,000 companies, most of the companies which are on stock markets in the world, and you can do the following. You take the revenues, and the revenues can be split into the various sectors, or if you want products or sector, it depends how you do it. So for each company, you can say this company operates in such and such sector. Now what you can do is to go back to the global and collect all the companies which are in Wall Street. So this gives you, again, something similar to what you showed, namely gives you, how Wall Street is distributed in products or in sectors. And guess what? It's also triangular. But now we have also the company information. And for the company, the opposite happens. Namely, the companies which are successful are specialized. So this is my challenge. Apart from the very small challenge, why do you get the triangular, which more or less we think one can understand, is very small. But then a grand but limited challenge is why countries are successful with specialization, and companies are successful with, why countries are successful with diversification, and companies are successful for specialization. So this means that there is not one general argument of how an economic entity works. Depending on the size, but also on the nature, one of the two elements we are discussing, or maybe there are even more, is prevailing. So it may be a very nice challenge. So if you have any comment, I would be very willing to listen to why for companies you have to specialize, and so the other Ricardo is right, I mean, and so on, but for countries is the opposite.
No, I think that one explains the other, that you have specialization at the lower level is the thing that explains diversification at the higher level. If you compare a rural medical facility with a major city hospital, the rural medical facility offers very few services by some generalist medical practitioners. And in the city hospital, you have oncologists, radiologists, anesthesiologists, and so on and so forth. So the doctors have specialized, but the hospital has diversified. So its specialization at the doctor level explains the diversification of the hospital, and so specialization at the corporate level explains diversification at the national level. They are so it was a mistake to think that what's true for the individual is true at the next stage.
Okay, so now we will break for lunch.